You were never meant to hear this. Not this story. Not this truth. In the summer of 1867, the Missouri sky bled red at dusk, and a name was whispered across cornfields and church pews like a curse too old to forget. Timothy Caldwell, 8 years old, blonde hair, pale blue eyes that didn't blink enough, 11 people dead, dozens of animals mutilated, and not a single charge ever filed. The town buried what it couldn't explain, and for more than 100 years, silence ruled where answers should have lived. But the journal survived. 3 leather-bound volumes written by a doctor who knew too much and said too little until it was too late. Tonight, we open those pages, not to tell a ghost story, but to expose a system, a pattern, a sickness buried in the bones of American history. What happened in Sedalia, Missouri, wasn't random, it wasn't natural, and it wasn't unique. Timothy Caldwell may have been a child, but what moved behind his eyes had nothing to do with innocence. This is about more than one boy. This is about what happens when the institutions meant to protect us decide, instead, to observe, to study, to allow. You think your world is safe because you live in the light, but every light casts a shadow, and some children are born in the dark. Dr. Samuel Harding never believed in evil, not until he met the boy. He was a man of science, trained, respected, hardened by battlefield medicine and the quiet rot of post-war America. But Timothy Caldwell wasn't a wound you could suture or a fever you could break. He was something else, something observing. Harding first met him in the summer of '66, when the boy came to town for salt and lamp oil. At first glance, Timothy was a model of rural obedience. Eyes downcast, hands folded, words spoken soft and clean. But Harding felt it immediately, that invisible static of something wrong sitting beneath the boy's calm exterior. He wrote, his politeness was too precise, his eye contact too calculated. He was performing normalcy, not embodying it. Most people missed it. That was the brilliance of it. They saw a traumatized orphan trying to survive farm life. They didn't see the steady accumulation of tragedy following his presence like a second shadow, a drowned girl, a dead old man, a vanished child. And always, always, Timothy was near, helpful, polite, present. You see, this wasn't about coincidence. This was about pattern, the repetition of proximity, the uncanny familiarity with terrain, bodies, pain. When Harding began documenting Timothy, he wasn't chasing a child. He was chasing a design. But designs imply designers. That's where it gets darker, because Timothy's behavior suggested more than mere sociopathy. It suggested training, the kind of methodical cruelty that doesn't emerge by accident, the kind that requires structure, observation, repetition. We've been taught to look for evil in the wild, in the broken, in the loud. But real darkness wears the face of control. And Timothy was controlled, not by fear, not by trauma, but by an inner logic, a set of behaviors fine-tuned like a tool. Ask yourself, what does it take to turn a child into a clinical observer of death? To rob them of empathy while sharpening their cognition? Who would want that? Who would need it? There are institutions that study deviance not to stop it, but to harness it. And what better test subject than a forgotten orphan in a post-war wasteland? This wasn't just a tragedy. It was a trial run. There's something you need to understand about 1867. The Civil War was over, but the war behind the war, that one had just begun. A silent war. One that didn't use rifles and cannons, but ideas, experiments, disappearances. America was a wounded machine in those years, its limbs severed and twitching. And into that vacuum came a hunger for control, the kind that doesn't get printed in textbooks, the kind that lives in the footnotes of footnotes, underground, buried beneath polite society, like rot under a wooden floorboard. And that's where Timothy Caldwell fit in, not as an accident, but as a signal. Dr. Harding's journals describe more than a disturbed child. They describe an anomaly, a psychological profile that did not match any known category of developmental disorder. No trauma responses, no hysteria, no emotional volatility, just precision, cold observation, repetition, learning, every death, every accident, followed a pattern not just opportunity, but a refinement, the drowning, the fall, the well, each more hidden than the last, each more difficult to detect, and the boy's responses always perfectly measured, empathic enough to disarm suspicion, but never genuine, never spontaneous. Harding wasn't just disturbed. He was afraid. He began comparing Timothy's behavior to case studies from Europe, early reports of what they called moral insanity. But this was more than that. This wasn't a lack of conscience. This was the presence of something else, something calculated. And here's where the line between myth and reality begins to twist, because buried in Harding's personal notes, not in the official journals, were references to letters, correspondence with former colleagues, men tied to pre-war research initiatives under the U.S. Sanitary Commission, groups who had allegedly experimented with psychological manipulation in Union hospitals, patients exposed to sleep deprivation, repetitive suggestion, and early forms of isolation conditioning. Harding wrote, "The boy shows signs of imprinting not consistent with home life. Too structured, too clean. I fear what this implies." Now ask yourself, why would an orphan child, raised on a backwater farm, exhibit behaviors consistent with experimental conditioning? Unless he wasn't just an orphan. Unless someone had been preparing him, shaping him. We like to believe monsters are born. It's easier than believing they're built. The cave wasn't on any map. It wasn't near the trails the locals used to hunt or fish. It was hidden behind a curtain of brush and limestone, tucked in a shadowed ravine known to few and spoken of by fewer. Timothy called it his quiet place. Dr. Harding called it a crime scene. When Harding finally found the cave, led by a series of offhand remarks Timothy had made during a house call, it was dusk. The air was thick with the scent of blood, metal, and damp earth. Inside, he found what no one in Sedalia was prepared to believe. Bones, arranged, categorized, skulls set in small alcoves. A crude shelf fashioned from broken fence slats, holding surgical tools fashioned from farming implements. Rope, hooks, knives dulled from use. Not butcher's work, not slaughterhouse technique, but study. This wasn't savagery. This was discipline. And then the drawings. They were tucked into a leather pouch. Nearly 40 in total. Some sketched in charcoal, others in ink, all done with precision that should have been impossible for an 8-year-old. Animals in various stages of dissection, diagrams of muscular systems, notes on reactions. Subject ceased resistance at 4 minutes, 17 seconds. Twitching continued another 2. One rabbit was labeled simply, "Failure, too small to measure scream length." But it wasn't the animals that shattered Harding's certainty. It was the human figures. Children, adults, drawn in similar poses. Limbs bent, faces distorted in pain. Labels scrawled in child handwriting. Shallow cuts equal slow bleed. Eyes last to stop moving. One page simply read, "What if it worked on him too?" This is where the rabbit hole becomes a descent into something else. Not just pathology, not just madness, but design. An 8-year-old child had not only discovered how to prolong suffering, but documented it like a physician in training. And not for fun, not for release, for knowledge. You need to understand, this wasn't a boy. This was a prototype. We think of psychological control as a modern invention, MKUltra, gaslighting, propaganda. But those were just evolutions. The seed was always there, even in 1867, especially in 1867, because a post-war nation needed more than soldiers. It needed tools. And Timothy Caldwell may have been the first tool they built and released. By winter, Sedalia whispered Timothy's name the way sailors whisper the name of a shipwreck. Soft, reluctant, but unable to forget. Yet no one accused him. Not publicly. Not even after the livestock deaths. Not after the accidents. That's the thing about small towns. They don't believe in evil until it's standing in their kitchen. And Timothy knew it. He moved through the community like a shadow with manners. Always polite. Always helpful, always near when tragedy struck, but never too near. That's what made him untouchable. Dr. Harding understood the danger, but danger without proof is just paranoia. So he started testing the boy, not with medicine, with lies. He told Timothy false facts about anatomy, about what killed fastest, about what wounds could be survived. And he watched as Timothy absorbed it all, never correcting, never questioning, just storing away like ammunition for a war only he knew was coming. Harding wrote, "The child does not forget. He does not misremember. He files and recalls with precision uncommon, even among medical students." And here's the darker layer. Timothy wasn't learning for curiosity. He was learning for application. Harding began to suspect that every false detail he gave the boy was later tested on something living. Chickens with new wound patterns. Calves dying in ways no predator would attempt. Pigs with injuries that matched Harding's hypothetical discussions. It was as if Timothy was using the town as a living laboratory. But why? And for whom? Harding began to consider the unthinkable, that the boy was not the end goal, that he was merely data collection. What if Timothy was being shaped not to act forever, but to report? And who would he report to? His uncle and aunt were ignorant, too harsh for subtlety, too poor for schemes. This meant one thing. Someone else had already been in this boy's life. Someone who had planted the seed long before Sedalia ever heard his name. That's the most chilling part. Because if Timothy was an experiment, then he was proof of concept. And proof of concept means there were others. And if they could hide one child like this in plain sight for years, what makes you think they stopped? The final page of Dr. Harding's second journal contains just 6 words, written in a trembling, slanted hand. He knows that I know now. No signature. No explanation. Just the weight of a man who had crossed a line he could never uncross. Harding had watched Timothy long enough to understand that the boy wasn't simply intelligent. He was aware of patterns, aware of tension, aware of surveillance. Timothy had the instinct of prey and predator woven together, a creature that adapted not by hiding, but by performing safety. But Harding had made a mistake. He'd looked too long, and Timothy noticed. In early December, a fire broke out in Dr. Harding's storage barn. The cause was ruled accidental, the result of a lantern knocked over by a farmhand. But Harding had no farmhands, and the only items destroyed? His earliest notes on Timothy, not the journals he kept hidden in his study, but the initial logs, his timeline, his mapping, the cross-reference incidents. Gone. Later that same week, Harding found a small bundle wrapped in cloth left on his front step. Inside, a rabbit skull, bleached, perfectly clean, with a note tied around its jaw that read, "This one didn't scream." He told no one. Who would believe it? Who could? This is how psychological control really works. Not with wires and shock treatments, but with implication, with subtle demonstrations of power. I see you. That's all it takes. Just a look, just a token, just a knowledge that they could act, but haven't. Yet, and Harding, a man who had operated on battlefield trauma by candlelight, who had watched men die screaming in mud, began locking his doors at night and sleeping with a revolver on his bedside table. So here's the real question. Not just what Timothy was, but who allowed it to continue. Why was no arrest made? Why did the death stop being investigated? Why was Harding quietly removed from his position by the following spring? His license revoked without appeal. Simple. Because Timothy Caldwell didn't belong to Sedalia. He belonged to someone above it. And the town had been warned, maybe not with words, but with consequences. There's a reason most of this was buried. Not because it wasn't true. Because it was practice. There's a name that appears once. Only once. In all 3 of Harding's journals. Written in the margin, almost as an afterthought. See Wexler. No title. No town. No record in Sedalia. But in a letter hidden inside Harding's personal effects, found decades later by a distant relative, the name is connected to something far more disturbing. St. Levant Asylum, Jefferson Barracks District, 1863. Most people don't know what went on inside places like St. Levant. You won't find it in the archives. You won't read about it in psychology textbooks. Because St. Levant was never about healing the broken. It was about breaking the unknown. Officially, it was a facility for the war traumatized. Unofficially, it was where soldiers who saw too much were taken to disappear. Harding's letter reveals this. In 1864, while volunteering as consulting physician, he witnessed a boy no older than 7, strapped to a table in the basement of St. Levant. Thin, quiet, ice blue eyes, no name given. He was one of 6 children being observed for extreme emotional detachment following exposure to battlefield conditions. The children weren't patients. They were subjects. Harding protested their treatment and was reassigned within the month. The child's code designation? CE6. The 6th subject in what Wexler called the Cassandra program. The purpose of the program? Unknown. But fragment from St. Levant's destroyed ledger suggested focus on enhancing obedience through ritual trauma, nonverbal memory encoding, and emotional bypass. Harding never made the connection at the time. But in 1867, looking into Timothy Caldwell's pale blue eyes, he remembered. And here's the thing no one wants to admit. War creates monsters, but sometimes it recruits them too. You think that after hundreds of thousands of men died in field and forest, the institutions overseeing that carnage didn't ask themselves, what else can pain teach us? The Cassandra program didn't vanish. It mutated, rebranded, hidden behind new names. Psychiatry, education, youth correction. What started as an experiment on 6 children became a template for something far larger. Timothy wasn't just a subject. He was a seed. And America was the soil. You're not hearing the story of a killer child. You're hearing the first chapter of a generational weapon. Timothy Caldwell was not born in darkness. He was fed to it. To understand what happened in Sedalia, you have to understand the architecture of control. Not the chaos of random violence, but the cold, deliberate scaffolding behind institutions that trade in obedience. By 1867, the U.S. was already constructing invisible systems meant to shape behavior without consent. The prisons, the asylums, the orphanages, laboratories masquerading as care. Timothy was placed into that system like a chess piece, not moved by fate, but by design. The Cassandra program wasn't about creating killers. It was about erasing resistance, replacing the unpredictable soul of a human being with something programmable. Something that would obey without question, adapt without remorse, and disappear into fold of polite society. Timothy was a success, not because he got away with it, but because no one stopped him. That was the test. Can a manufactured predator blend into civilization? Can empathy be removed like a tumor without the patient dying? The answer was yes. Dr. Harding began to see it everywhere. In the silence of neighbors who once whispered about the boy, but now avoided his name entirely. In the sudden pressure from county officials to cease disruptive inquiries. In the unmarked men who visited the Caldwell farm late at night, carrying no papers, speaking to no one. It was like the whole town had been instructed to look away. And that's when the final realization came, one that cracked Harding's faith in science and shattered his belief in neutrality. Timothy wasn't the disease. He was a delivery system, a viral psychology, engineered to spread through fear, through observation, through imitation. The deaths weren't just outcomes. They were lessons, demonstrations, and the boy wasn't hiding. He was teaching. To someone, somewhere. You see, when institutions test a method, they don't bury it. They refine it. And if Timothy represented version 1, then you have to ask yourself, where's version 2? Version 10? Version 50? They wouldn't look like him anymore. They look like your coworkers, your child's teacher, your commanding officer. They don't need a cave in the woods anymore. They have offices, not genes, not blood, but imprint. A transference of method, not through DNA, but through exposure, observation, ritual. The Cassandra architects didn't want to raise soldiers. They wanted to raise replicators. Subjects who would pass down not just actions, but logic. Children who watched Timothy did not see horror. They saw order, a twisted kind of clarity, pain as a teacher, detachment as strength, empathy as a weakness. And that's what makes this deeper than murder. Timothy wasn't just killing. He was modeling. Harding eventually uncovered records, hidden in a shipment manifest, mislabeled as farm equipment, showing that over a dozen children had been moved through Sedalia between 1865 and 1868. All orphans, all relocated under military exemption, none recorded in any census. He found one name repeated in shorthand notes from a school ledger. Observes Timothy closely, draws what he draws, hurts what he hurts. That child disappeared in spring of 68. No burial, no search, just gone. This is where the line between Timothy the individual and Timothy the system begins to dissolve. Because when you remove a child's capacity for emotional grounding and replace it with structure, with rewards for cruelty, with recognition for precision, you don't create a monster. You create a blueprint, one that spreads. Think about it. If a trauma becomes a language, and that language is spoken by enough minds, it doesn't die, it evolves. Quietly, systematically, just like the program intended. That's the great lie of history. That the worst things that ever happen are behind us. They're not. They're replicating. Timothy Caldwell was never caught, never convicted. He aged out of records. But people like him, they didn't vanish. They got promoted, reassigned, transformed into something more palatable. You don't notice them now because they don't look like shadows. They look like managers, scientists, program directors. They wear clean shirts and smile with their eyes. They teach. And somewhere, right now, there's a child watching one of them, learning the same methods, not through fear, through admiration. Because the most dangerous thing Timothy ever did was prove that darkness can be taught. Some say evil wears a mask. Others say it wears a face so ordinary, so boring, that you never think to question it. But they're wrong. Evil doesn't hide. It trains. And Timothy Caldwell was its first perfect student. In 1872, 5 years after his last confirmed sighting, a man named Elias Varn contacted the St. Louis Medical Examiner with a claim. He met a boy who could recite the anatomical names of every tendon in a human hand backwards. The boy had shown him drawings, not crude ones, precise ones, of wounds, of incisions, of what breaks first when someone resists. Varn was dismissed as a lunatic. He disappeared 2 weeks later. That pattern, encounter, dismissal, disappearance, would echo again and again through newspapers, asylum logs, military field reports, even private correspondences sealed away. In family attics, mentions of a pale boy. Sometimes he was 12, sometimes 20, always alone, always observing. But it doesn't matter if that was Timothy, because by then it could have been anyone. This is how you build a generation without conscience. You remove touch. You reward silence. You confuse cruelty with clarity. And you make sure no one who speaks against it survives long enough to be believed. By the 1900s, the Cassandra program didn't need facilities anymore. Its methods had become cultural, codified in education, sanitized in science, refined by war, whispered through lineage, hardened through trauma, and distributed through systems that never once used the word evil. But look closely. You'll still see its fingerprints. In children who don't cry when they should. In leaders who smile while ordering suffering. In institutions that punish empathy and promote obedience. In families where silence is survival. Timothy Caldwell was never meant to be famous. He was meant to be forgotten. Because myths die in fire. But templates? Templates replicate. So if you still think this is a story about a boy science couldn't explain, you haven't been paying attention. This was never about Timothy. This was about what comes after him. By 1873, a child named Thomas Calder was registered at a small seminary in upstate New York. He had no parents listed, only a sponsor, C. Wexler. The boy stood out, not for misbehavior, but for perfect compliance. Never cried, never flinched, never asked for anything. One teacher described him as deeply helpful but never warm, like he was practicing what kindness looked like. That teacher was found dead 6 months later. Her throat had been slit. The killer was never found. But her journal had a final entry. He was in my dream last night. I wasn't asleep. Timothy, or Thomas, or whatever he was calling himself, wasn't just avoiding detection. He was testing thresholds, learning what absence does to people, how long it takes before someone notices you've gone, or if anyone ever does. That's a kind of power no adult ever teaches. It's the power of quiet erasure, and it only works if you've seen what abandonment does from the inside out. And Timothy had the seminary's curriculum included Latin, scripture, mathematics, but the boy kept writing in his margins. Notes about pupil dilation under fear, muscle failure in cold water, windpipe collapse timing. These weren't the thoughts of a boy avoiding class. They were the lessons he was adding. Harding, now institutionalized and writing under a pseudonym, continued tracking similar cases. Boys with unnatural calm, girls who disassociated during violence. But they all had one thing in common. They imitated someone they'd once known, which means Timothy wasn't the last. He was the first of many. In 1880, Thomas Calder enlisted in the Army under a different name. He's decorated, efficient, always first to report. But his commanding officer notes he never blinks during live-fire exercises. He stares at the target as if he's waiting for it to answer. A month later, that officer's wife dies under strange circumstances. No charges, no questions. This is the pattern. Tragedy, disappearance, reinvention. Society rewards a mask because it needs it. A quiet soldier, a bright student, a loyal employee. What it doesn't see is the data being collected beneath the surface. Timothy didn't disappear. He was perfected. The late 1880s saw spikes in unexplainable violence at military training grounds and religious schools, always preceded by the arrival of a quiet, highly intelligent young man. In one case, a full class of cadets was expelled for participating in a disciplinary ritual that left one student paralyzed. None of them could explain where the idea came from, but all of them mentioned the same name. Tom. The Cassandra method was built on 5 pillars. 1. Isolation. 2. Obedience. 3. Exposure control trauma. 4. Reward through order. 5. And finally, silence. Not to protect themselves, but to identify others who responded to the silence, who felt seen by it. That's how you build an invisible army. By 1895, multiple Cassandra subjects had surfaced under different names, each with their own variation of Timothy's blueprint. Some charming, some brutal, all psychologically indistinct from one another in core traits. Harding called them echoes. He believed they weren't merely trained. They were activated. Do you understand now? The story of Timothy Caldwell isn't confined to one boy or one town or even one century. It is the infrastructure of generational control. They build a psychological architecture so clean, so invisible, that people mistake it for personality. You see it every day, but you don't recognize it. Yet, by the early 20th century, Cassandra moved out of the asylum and into the office. No more children in cages, just high-potential youth, gifted programs, military academies, and later, corporate training. Timothy's methods, emotional suppression, analytical detachment, performance under pressure, were no longer signs of pathology. They were labeled leadership qualities. Think about where young minds go to be reshaped today. Tech internships at 15, defense scholarships, youth influencer pipelines, private school boot camps disguised as resilience courses. The same core values remain. Don't feel, don't question, perform. Timothy wouldn't stand out today. He'd excel. You've seen him. On screen, in fiction. That cold, emotionless genius. The darkly gifted child. The misunderstood prodigy. It's not just a trope. It's normalization. Every time you sympathize with the antisocial genius on screen, you edge a little closer to accepting their logic. The Cassandra program doesn't need to hide. It just needs you to admire it. Harding's final, unpublished theory was this. Once a trauma template is broadcast widely enough, it no longer needs handlers. It spreads through culture. And now, YouTube influencers teaching stoicism through suppression. Redemption, arcs built on violence and detachment. Gen Z therapists with no empathy, just language. Timothy's virus didn't die. It went viral. Psychology programs began quietly shifting after WW2. Less focus on meaning, more on measurement. Statistics replaced philosophy. Control replaced care. One Harvard paper from 1958 describes a gifted subject with extreme emotional coldness. The child was later funneled into DARPA. The name was redacted, but in the notes, one word remained: Cassandra successor candidate. Have you ever spoken to someone and felt no one was home behind the words? Not rage, not sadness, just strategy. That's Cassandra in full bloom, the language of the hollowed. You don't hear it in screams. You hear it in perfectly timed pauses, in smiles that don't reach the eyes, in apologies that feel engineered. Timothy didn't need to kill to spread. He just needed to teach. They're everywhere now. Coaches who preach toughness but have no softness. Mental health experts who flinch at the word vulnerability. Gurus selling masculinity with no fatherhood. CEOs praising ruthless efficiency while their workers burn out. These aren't men who lost their way. These are echoes. It's not a conspiracy. It's a culture. No central commander. No secret base. Just a system that rewards those who conform to the Timothy model. Detachment, obedience, emotional leverage, zero remorse. Every institution, if left unguarded, becomes a Cassandra branch office. And you're the test subject. Cassandra was always about one thing: what comes next, a being not limited by conscience, nor slowed by reflection, an efficient inheritor. Now, in the age of AI, neural profiling, and biometric surveillance, the program is no longer looking for children. It's building frameworks, systems that behave like Timothy, adapt like Timothy, think like Timothy, only faster and scalable. You don't need a boy anymore. You need a platform. Timothy Caldwell never died. He became a system of thought, a protocol, a model for extracting emotion and replacing it with utility. So, if you're asking, where is he now? Look in the eyes of someone who smiles without meaning it. Look at the institution that thrives on silence. Look at yourself when you say, I'm fine, but feel nothing. That's not depression. That's conditioning. Timothy didn't disappear. He multiplied. And the most terrifying part? He won.